posting it on our YouTube account in case if you'd like to go back. And also, if you have any questions, use the chat function, and Allyson will probably ask some questions where you may need to raise your hand. So please do use this function in MS Teams. Well, thanks very much, and yeah, let's move on.
So great. So this is it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Allyson Lister, who received her Master's in Computational Biology from the University of York and her PhD in Computer Science from Newcastle University. So in 2021, she became the Content and Community Lead for FAIRsharing, where her responsibilities include coordination of data, establishing collaboration within the user community, and outreach across all research domains. So you might remember her from somewhere else, as she has also previously appeared in the FAIR Data podcast, and today the topic of her presentation will be on FAIRsharing, discover and curate an ecosystem of research standard and databases. So let us welcome Dr. Allyson.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me here. And I'm trying to give this talk today because I have the luxury of a little bit more time with just a little bit more of a light-hearted touch. So if you do have any questions, put them into the chat and I will try to look occasionally and answer them as we go. Also, I want to gauge the, what sort of things you guys already know about and adjust my talk slightly accordingly. So the big word at the top here, FAIRsharing, is our project. And what I'm going to do is tell you about what FAIRsharing is, but in the context of the FAIR principles, and also in the context of some of the other projects our group at Oxford builds, such as the FAIR Cookbook, which is a great resource of recipes that work as guidelines to help you actually, from a very practical perspective, with worked examples and code, make things fair, okay, make digital objects fair. And before I get started and jump right into the FAIR principles, I just would like a show of hands, either virtually or in the room, as to those who feel like they are comfortable with what the FAIR principles are, even if they don't know it in depth. So raise your hand if you feel pretty comfortable with the FAIR principles. I can see 2 hands raised in the virtual world. And let's see what it says in the chat. We've got another one, thank you. I like that. We're going for cool emojis today. So I wouldn't say a lot of you then, because I haven't had a huge amount in the chat. Yeah, so that's good to know, because it means that it's the right way to start with a little overview of the FAIR principles, because certainly everyone in the data and the research data fields, the field of open data and FAIR data, spends a lot of time talking about the FAIR principles. And certainly funders and journals and policymakers in general are spending a lot of time talking about the FAIR principles. But why should you care? And what are they? So this is how we're going to start. I should also say that as well as being affiliated with the University of Oxford, I also have been doing some work for over the past few months and for the next year within this Research Data Alliance and EOSC Future Domain Ambassador program. So this is something where I'm meant to engage with lots of different research domains and really showcase the work of the Research Data Alliance and within EOSC Future as well, which is this big overarching infrastructure that spreads its influence across all of Europe. And what I'll be doing then in relation to that is also tell you a little bit about the RDA, because it's a pretty awesome thing. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this entire talk, it's my favorite quote ever, which was first tweeted, as far as I'm aware, by a man called Jason Scott over a decade ago. And it's that metadata is a love note to the future. And so if you keep that in mind, then everything else comes really easily. rule number 2 of this talk is relationships. Relationships are super important. And if you can remember those 2 things, then really I feel this talk has been a really success. So bearing in mind that metadata is a love note to the future, let's move on to the FAIR principles. So what does it matter whether we standardize our formats? Now, I know a lot of you in the room will understand the importance of standard descriptions, of community standards, of sharing data in a way where everybody understands what you're talking about. But I like to start with these very simple examples just to really showcase the reasons behind why the FAIR principles were originally created. So even back in 2019, which admittedly was a few years ago now, there was a lovely paper in Scientific Data that said that most metadata field names and their values are not standardized or controlled. Even simple field types are often inadequately populated with information about what they're describing. And here we have an example of lots of different ways in which you can write age. And in a slightly more lighthearted example, again, I'm going to go on to gene definitions. So whether or not you're in the life sciences, it doesn't matter, because you'll be able to see even within the life sciences, when people talk about genes, they have a lot of different ideas. Here we have a circular definition. A gene is an interactor of genetic interaction, which doesn't really give you much information. Here we have a structural definition, which you don't need to memorize. I'm not going to give you a quiz at the end, but it really describes genes from a structural perspective. And here we have a functional definition. And these are all different ontologies trying to tell you what they think genes are. And this tells you what a gene does, okay? Then we have the either or running out of cool gene pictures. See if you can figure out why Sonic the Hedgehog was in our previous slide. Here's an either or. Well, it's either this or maybe it's that. And you see we're building up with lots of different, quotes, official definitions of genes that all actually mean something different. And that's not going to be great for sharing data and standardizing data. Here we have a kitchen sink definition with the lovely Jean Kelly helping us out, which seems to include everything they possibly can. Now, these definitions are a few years old. Some of them, I made the slides a few years ago. Some of them may be more up to date now, but the essential meaning remains. And here we have what I would sort of say is good, but someone else might not. And again, Sonic and Pikachu are here for a very particular reason that relates to genes. And if you haven't already figured it out, it's because people have named genes after these 2 lovely cartoon characters. And so I just felt it all the more appropriate to include them to keep your attention. So we have lots of different definitions of genes. We have lots of different ways of writing age. That was my other example. And there's all sorts of ways in which we need to share data more effectively. And that generally comes down to sharing them in a standard way. So then comes in the FAIR Principles paper. And this was made back in 2016 by a variety of people, mainly, but not completely, from the life sciences, because there's been a long history of community standards development within the life sciences. So it has a lot of accesses. A lot of people are tweeting about it. Yes, it's all fantastic. People like to cite it. But what does it mean from a practical perspective? Well, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's what FAIR is. And it's a set of principles to help you improve the value of your digital objects so that they can be reused. And the important thing here is reused by humans and machines, because it's not enough that 2 humans can talk about a data set or an object in the digital sphere and understand each other. It's also important that the programs they're using to analyze and assess are also understanding them. FAIR is also something that often gets called a spectrum. It's an aspiration. It's not a yes or no. You're not going to have a binary result. You are fair or you aren't fair. Yes, it's a continuum of features for which you can sit somewhere along. Okay, and I will take a quote from an author that my son loves a lot. Fairness doesn't mean everyone gets the same. It means everyone gets what they need. And what we're saying is we're being careful to say that being fair doesn't have to just be defined in one way. So let's have a little look at the different parts, the different parts, the F, the A, the I, and the R. And if we have a little look at what it means for each of these, well, findability, that's often the simplest to explain to someone. It's about persistent identifiers, the ability to find something because you've identified it uniquely and persistently, and usually it resolves automatically without you having to do anything extra. Interoperability is all about community-defined metadata and metadata formats, so you're sharing standards that you can all describe things the same way. Reusability, this is where we go to the those definitions of genes and how to describe age. These are terminologies often used within the reusability scheme as well as some of the others, because there's a lot of overlap. And that's to ensure that we're all talking about the same thing. What my definition of gene is and your definition of gene is the same. And we have a few more examples here that talks about provenance to contextualize the data, and the statement that often gets used in combination with FAIR, which is as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. The important point here is to remember that open does not mean, FAIR does not mean open. That's the right way around. FAIR does not mean open, okay? So when you hear about open data and FAIR data, they're not synonymous, and you don't have to, especially if you've got sensitive data, whether that's maybe psychology surveys or human trials. You can ensure that you can still be fair even if you're not open. And of course, a big part of reusability is the licensing involved. So finally, you just want to remember that the FAIR principles are principles, yes, but they're not hard rules. So they aren't a simple yes or no. The principles themselves don't represent a standard format that you have to comply to. They're guidance to help you reach the point at which you can share data effectively, but they're not strict. And so that is the end of the sort of general overview of the FAIR principles, but I do want to just pause here for 10 seconds or so. I mean, longer if you have questions, but just to see if anyone has any questions with my very high level overview of what the FAIR principles are. You know, we really are here to, I don't see any hands up at the moment, and that's fine. We're here to make sure that the FAIR principles are used to help enable the open, well, no, here I am making it synonymous with open, enable data sharing that's effective and can help enable research data and progress within research. And that's enough waffling, because I've given everyone, oh, we've got one person that might be having a question.
Hi, Allyson.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This is Anna. I'm actually the Open Access Research Data Officer at UEA. So I'm not a researcher, but obviously have a very strong interest and overlap with the things that you're talking about here. So it's really great to have you giving this session. Really interested. One thing I just wanted to maybe this is not a great topic to open up so early, but I just wondered that talking about definitions and making sure that everybody's talking about the same thing, I've also found is really, really important when you're talking about a lot of things to do with data and data management and data sharing. And one of those definitions is actually what data.
Yes.
What we mean by data. And I don't want to necessarily open a massive can of worms because we've got an hour, you know, we've got limited time, but I just wondered if that was something that you thought was, you know, if you had any comments about that side of things.
It's actually super important. And you know, as you say, if you had a whole day, I would be happy to talk with you about what, because my background is actually as an ontologist. So if you get me started on the meaning of things, then we will be here all day. But it's a really valid question and really important one. I have to say also that in your role in data support and research support, it's sort of where I am sitting as well. And data stewardship and librarians, they're all at the core of what it means to enable FAIR data. So I think it's a really important job within the scope of this whole conversation. But for data itself, yeah, I love talking about it because what data means is completely different to different people. So for us in FAIR sharing, our registry is actually descriptions of databases and descriptions of standards. So our data is actually these descriptions of registries, yes? And that's a completely different type of data to someone who's digitizing collections in a natural history museum, because their data is actually not the underlying thing, the physical thing. That's what they're really interested in. The data is a view of it. And then you have people who are doing software repositories. And so, you know, software registries, that is. And so their bits of software in there are actually their data, if you wanted to lump it all under the one word that means data, which most people don't. So I agree with you. It's a hot topic, and it's one that everyone will invariably, I think, always have a different definition for. But I think when it comes down to it, as long as your project is at least defining clearly what you mean by it. At least that's a first step. But I think people are trying to say things like digital object, and I'm trying to use that a little bit more in my talk as well today, because that encompasses most of what everyone means when they're actually using the word data. And then that brings you also nicely on to the next step in enabling FAIR data, which isn't just the structure of the data itself or the data that's within part of this digital object, but also the compartmentalization of it into something like research object crates. Yes, so these are almost like specialist zip files that will contain everything you need to reproduce an experiment. And so there's lots of ways to sort of hide the issue by saying things like digital object. But also, I agree that data is a very loaded term. Does that sort of answer? At least I'm commiserating with you. Perfect, lovely. So FAIR sharing. FAIR sharing is a registry of data policies, databases, and community standards. Okay, so we don't store raw data itself. What we do store is descriptions, and these are curated, manually curated descriptions of these different types of resources. And most importantly, with the second thing I asked you to remember today, relationships among them. So we can tell you about the standards implemented by a database, or the policy, the recommendations that a policy has for which databases or standards to use it. And we are also cross-discipline. We'll take any kind of resource you have that fits in one of these three categories. We'd love to have your description of it, whether it's in humanities or astronomy or life science. And what we're doing here is we're trying to help enable FAIR data by making it easier for all of our different users, whether they're researchers or research support roles, to find the resources they need to structure their data, to store their data, and to align with policy requirements. Okay. And right now we have over 3,800 records among these three, you might say, registries within FAIR sharing. We have over 1,000 people who contribute actively to FAIR sharing. Now, there's two ways you can do that. These are to maintain a record. So if you're a standard developer or a database developer, you come and make an account and make sure our description of your resource is correct. You can also be a community curator, which I'll get onto later. And what we do primarily is focus on two different ways of looking at FAIR sharing. Firstly, as the consumer of FAIR sharing, people who come to visit to try to find the right database and the right standard for them to use. And also the people who come as producers. Those are people who create those standards and develop databases and wish to promote them. We have a large number of different stakeholders, as I say, both among researchers themselves and also among research support, like librarians and data stewards, as we talked about earlier, but also policymakers, infrastructures, and a whole slew of journal publishers of other different groups that we work with to try to make sure that the information we're providing for you and the information you're adding to our records is the information you really want to see. And because we're all about making sure that we shine the light back on you. And so, as with so many things, we want to enable FAIR. And one of the ways we do that is we also try to comply with FAIR ourselves in lots of different ways. And so this is a slide for the techies. No need for you to spend much time on it if you're not interested in JSON markup or schema.org, but we do have our own ways of making sure that we are complying with the FAIR principles as a registry itself. But then I want to come back to those relationships, because providing this information can be a challenge. As with any manually curated resource, there's always a pinch point. And that is in actually keeping everything up to date and ensuring those relationships are well formed, because we want to create a sort of view of the entire ecosystem, the entire landscape within a particular domain of those interconnected databases, standards, and policies, because you can't just have a registry that just lists databases or standards without half the benefit is in how they interact. But of course, that is a big challenge for us. And that makes, although relationships are at the core of what we do, both with our user community and with the resource records themselves, it's hard. And so we look to our user community a lot for that. So going a little bit more briefly into the relationships we have. Firstly, the relationships within the records themselves. So this is a blown up view of the slide you just saw of the 3 different types of records we have, and a little graph in the middle. This is one graph of a particular research consortium and all the resources they have in FAIRsharing and how they connect to each other within the consortium, okay? And here's a slightly bigger version for you to see. Again, don't try to read the text. This is just about showing you that we have graphs for every record in FAIRsharing to show you that ecosystem. And this happens to be a biodiversity consortium who have worked with us to perform a landscape analysis of all of the resources linked to the organizations within that consortium, because our graphs, they're live. You can click on a node and look at another graph, and you can end up going down the rabbit hole a bit like Wikipedia to find all the different connections. The other type of relationships we have are with people who use FAIRsharing programmatically. Okay, so we have an API, and this allows people to use the metadata within FAIRsharing for fair assessment and evaluation. FAIRsharing does not make any statement about how fair a resource is. We provide all the metadata we can that you guys as a community say is relevant to you. And then we let the assessment and evaluation tools do their work, because we're going to remain agnostic. We've chosen to just present the information for other people to use as they need to. And so a number of different fair evaluation tools, such as the Fair Evaluator by Mark Wilkinson, use us. We also have data management plan tools like the Data Stewardship Wizard and others that use our metadata to help people create data management plans. We also have an ongoing collaboration with OpenAIR and their knowledge graph, which allows them to access our metadata. And we also keep FAIRassist.org running, which is at the moment a table of all these different tools about how you can enable FAIR via these tools. It will be more in the coming 4 to 6 months as well. We also have relationships with community guidance and standards. These are how we build the metadata that we ask you to fill out on our records. Again, the important thing to take away from here is we're integrating constantly with different infrastructures and community organizations and networks to make sure that the metadata we're asking for from you are relevant and not just created for the sake of it. And I mentioned the RDA earlier, the Research Data Alliance. I highly recommend that you take a look at it if you're at all interested in what's done with research data, because it's a volunteer network worldwide where people can join working groups and interest groups about the particular parts of research data that interest them. I'm a co-chair on 2 different working groups, including one that is currently looking at what we should require of databases. What minimal information should all databases provide to make sure that they're giving the information necessary to researchers so that they can make an informed decision about which database to submit their data to. And I've also worked with some people within the Digital Curation Center and FAIR's FAIR with the same sort of criteria and attributes, but for data policies. In the bottom right, we have the first mention of the FAIR Cookbook, which I might touch on later on, and the RDM Kit. These are both guidance sites that help you find the ways to be fair from a sort of step-by-step instructional way. And these are both at the moment targeted within the life sciences, but the FAIR Cookbook can be, if you're a techie at all, you can build your own instance of the FAIR Cookbook to cover whatever domain you're interested in. And what happens is we get these guidance from these organizations such as the RDA, and on the left we have a list of attributes that they think that that we should be covering. And on the right, we have in fact, I think I've just used the policy table for the database, but I'm sure that all of you will forgive me in this particular instance, because one table looks much like another. That we transfer the information about what the important attributes are, and we put them within the FAIRsharing data model. And we do the same for policies. This is a screenshot from a recent presentation we gave together with the Digital Curation Center about how we do this for policies. And that results in another lovely table that I'm sure you will be fascinated to read every section of when you go off and do your homework after this call. But suffice it to say that one of our community curators has already found this very important, because we've only recently added this new metadata to our policy records. And he said that he's found it extremely helpful to understand what should go in a policy. I mean, if you're writing a policy as an institution, for example, if the UEA was about to make or update their data policy for researchers, how do you know you've got everything in there? You know, might you be missing something that otherwise would be really relevant to your community? And by following the metadata that is available when you're describing your policy with us, you can make sure you're including all the necessary information. And you get a beautiful table in FAIRsharing that shows all the ways in which you're compliant or otherwise with various aspects. Finally, I want to just touch on the relationships within our community, because that's the part that I like the most. And so this is, again, where I say we have over 1,000 users that are linked either to a record or to a domain of which they're considered an expert. And this could be a research domain like astronomy, or it could be a domain within a type of records, like they're keen on updating policy records. Okay, so this is the FAIRsharing. The main way that I'm going to talk about here is the FAIRsharing community curation. I can't speak this afternoon. The FAIRsharing community curator program. Okay, so we have our users, our maintainers, who work mainly on one or just a few records because they are direct developers of those records. Then we have our community curators who have come to us saying they're quite keen on either learning about the databases and standards that are a part of their research domain, or they feel they already know it quite well and they want to make sure that FAIRsharing is describing it well. In both cases, they contribute to us by curating content, by contributing to any educational material that's relevant to them. And in return, we give them attribution. We are a trusted partner with ORCID, and we also have a collaboration with ROAR. And what we can do is we can push your work with us to the membership and services section of your ORCID profile. And then you can show on a resume or to people in your community that you are working with us in this way and gain attribution for your work. Now, another way that we work with community is by making sure that they have a space on FAIRsharing dedicated to them. And these are our collections, which are branded pages grouping standards and repository records within FAIRsharing according to their needs. And there's a variety of different reasons people have created collections with us. They want to list resources they've developed, such as this astronomy consortium, the Virtual Observatory Alliance. They want to list resources that they recommend, even if they don't necessarily create them. They want to list resources developed within a particular community or maybe mapped in the case of crosswalks. And we can also attribute our users who come to us and maintain records with us, or attribute our community curators, or even attribute our organizations. Because on the left here, we have the list of all of the resources that are related to, in this case, an organization called GBIF. And on the right, we have a snippet of a user profile for one of our community curators. But for any of our users, it shows those resources they maintain and have edited and the organizations they belong to, another way to attribute the work with us. And I think what I will do is take questions about the community curation program at the end, but I've given you an overview of that. So I'm going to skip past the detailed example, the use case of one of our community curators, and move on to the FAIR cookbook, because I think this might also be really relevant for you guys. And it will give us time to talk a little bit more either about this or about any of the other aspects in our question and answer session. So forgive me while I skip past the use case. You can try to read really fast if you like, but it's just a few slides. That was a particular use case, that's all. So now we're moving on to the FAIR cookbook. So this is a project which, as it says, as you would expect from the name, creates a series of recipes. And it's open for everyone to use. And there are lots of different stakeholders who have contributed to its development. And it's really all about enabling FAIR. So if like you guys were, you were a little unsure about raising your hand at the beginning of the talk about whether or not you understand the FAIR principles, but you know how important it is. You've been told by your funders, or you've been asked by your colleagues to help to help ensure that the data you're producing in your experiments and in your research projects are all going to be fair. Then you're thinking, well, that's great. It's really super. I want to be fair too, but I don't really know how to get started. Then the FAIR Cookbook is a really great place to start. All the recipes I say at the moment are within the life sciences, but many of them are generic. They're like how to work with getting persistent identifiers, or how to format a data set. And so even though the particular examples will be life sciences, if you're not a researcher in the life sciences, you might well still find a large number of the recipes relevant to you. So let's see why we created the FAIR Cookbook. So there's lots and lots of generic FAIR guidance. There's lots of websites you can go to on the Go FAIR website, or in the publication itself, and a variety of other places that talk about the different parts of FAIR and, broadly speaking, what it means. I've even given you a short introduction at the beginning of this, but there's not very much specific guidance and a lack of very practical examples. And that's what a lot of people really need to get started. So what the FAIR Cookbook does is target specific situations and goals to help create these sort of applied examples through this recipe format. And so what you get is aligned against these chapters, which are organized according to the FAIR principles and a few other things. You get recipes covering actual operational steps within FAIR data management. And it's intended for lots of different people. It's got technical examples for people who are software developers, managers, or data scientists. It's got educational material and ability to link out through to it for the higher level research roles amongst you. And also it's just a place where lots of different authors can come together and write recipes that they know works for enabling FAIR data. Lots and lots of different people have contributed to the FAIR Cookbook so far. And this is not just in academia, though there's a lot of academic partners. It's also in industry. And it's also broadly covered within Elixir. Now, Elixir might be a logo you're not completely familiar with necessarily. It's part of the European Open Science Cloud. This is the broad umbrella organization called EOSC. And Elixir is responsible for the infrastructure required to support research in the life sciences. And so a lot of these tools come out of this particular cluster. But the FAIR Cookbook has had many partners within academia and industry. And there are already over 70 recipes with nearly 100 authors covering lots of different topics and lots of different parts of the FAIR principles themselves. And first, when you come to use it, figure out what you need. You know, today, what I really want to focus on is ensuring that I cover the F in FAIR, or that I want to work with one of the other ones. And then you can go to that section of the FAIR Cookbook and find the recipe cards, the recipes themselves, that will cover the different aspects that you're looking for. And when you go to a recipe, it has this recipe card at the top, just like you might expect if you still used handwritten recipes in the kitchen. And it tells you all sorts of summary information, how long it'll take to read, if there's any code in there that you can run, how difficult it will be, and more importantly, what level of maturity your data will be once you apply the recipe to your work. Will it be rich? Will it be considered mature? Or will you need to follow on with a few other recipes before you get there? And it's an open resource. It uses all sorts of open tools and software. So you can absolutely get started and contribute. And there's lots of ways, if you do contribute, how you can be credited for your work, including a variety of ways in which they can show how you've contributed to a recipe. And a recipe itself starts often with a graphical overview, moves on to the ingredients you'll need to run the recipe, and then gives you step-by-step instructions for actually performing the task, and examples followed by what you can read next. So broadly speaking, as a summary, what I want to get at with you is that it's not just a resource that you need to understand. You really want to look at its place within the landscape that it sits within your research domain. So when you have a piece of data, or when you're building a data management plan, don't just say, well, gosh, I know I need to put my data somewhere, so I'll just choose this particular repository and then I'm done. You really need to explore what is happening around it, the formats that it might implement, the requirements it might have. Does your policy maker have any requirements when you have taken a funded project? And then it's these relationships we build both among the resources that we are using and among the people that we're talking to, like we are today, that really help you learn and engage with FAIR and make it seem maybe not so tricky in the end after all. And I suppose I should circle back to the very first take home I asked you to remember, which is that metadata is a love note to the future, and that by using the FAIR principles, what you are really doing is showing your appreciation, not just to future researchers, but to future you, because I know that my thesis, for example, has printouts of code in the back of it, and that code is gone now. It was on a Subversion server, which was like pre-GitHub, and then that server was local to my university. That's now gone. So I can't get that back because I didn't think ahead, even about myself or about the people who since have said, oh, that is a pretty cool PhD. You know, can I have this stuff? And I'd say, I'd love to give it to you, but I can't. And so really, it's just about creating a community. FAIR is about creating a community of practice that really is always thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And I think that's about all I was going to say. And I've hit roughly my time. So I will certainly be very happy to take questions or to go over the use case that I covered, that I skipped in this talk, or just talk about anything else within the realm of FAIR or the topics that we've covered today. So thank you. Oh, I should also say, if you want to be a community curator, thank you very much. Then I would be very happy to talk with you, because we're always looking for new community curators.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Allyson. I think we should do something for the, yeah, it was very interesting and really fascinating stuff. Thanks very much for sharing with us. I just wanted to remind our participants, you can leave your questions in the chat function. Meanwhile, I would like to convey some messages from the room. So some of them, one of them has to do with challenges. So what do you think are some of the challenges that people might be facing when using FAIRsharing?
If it's FAIRsharing itself, I think often what we see is that people come to us because their journals have said, come to FAIRsharing because they'll tell you where to put your data. And as long as it's recommended within your domain and it fulfills these requirements, then use FAIRsharing to figure out where to put it. We don't have to tell you exactly where. That can sometimes be a bit daunting for people who maybe haven't put data anywhere other than perhaps Zenodo before. And so sometimes having the guidance that FAIRsharing can provide can help. But in the future, in the next 4 to 6 months, we're rolling out a brand new wizard to help people gently ease into their options within FAIRsharing. So that should be quite exciting as well. But we already have lots and lots of different ways in which you can search FAIRsharing. If we're talking about FAIR and the challenges in FAIR, I think it's that historically funders haven't given the visibility that they should to people whose job it would be to be data champions. So these are data stewards, either employed by the university or directly by a larger project. These are librarians. These are maybe people who are researchers, but who have a special knowledge of FAIR and could become their project's data champion. These need to go in at the level of when the project is getting funded, because often people think about FAIR at the end, but what you need is someone who's going to look after you from the beginning, because that makes it a lot easier. And data stewardship is a role. It's a sort of a data stewardship role combined with community engagement, because you need to work within your community to advertise what FAIR is and make it seem simple, because it is, but people often think of it as something that's quite daunting. You know, I want to just do my research and then forget about it, but actually thinking about these things is not too tricky as long as you have some to sort of guide you along the way. And then it seems, Nico, hello. Gatekeeping. I didn't know you were here. That's really nice. It's widely known that nowadays designing a new standard or policy is much easier than collaborating with others to adopt an existing one that fits 80%. Will you, for example, ever consider to block submissions if there's already a suitable existing standard? Ooh, I like that. Controversial there. I think that FAIRsharing's policy is to accept any standard that has been developed for a particular community and seems to have appropriate buy-in from that community, or is in fact developed within by a representative group of that community. So in theory, we shouldn't say no if someone has done their own thing, but in a way that already has buy-in from the community that they're trying to get it from. Because we try really hard. It's sort of the same answer that I'd give if we said, do you do FAIR assessment? Will you put some kind of score on FAIRsharing records that say what FAIRsharing thinks of the resource compared, you know, based on the metadata has been provided? And we try to remain agnostic and really provide a way for people to search rather than a judgment on what comes in. If it's not a community standard, if it's just some a master's student making an ontology, it wouldn't be in scope. It's probably not quite the answer you want to hear, Nico, but that is the answer that it is. We try not to pass judgment as long as it fits broadly within the domain of a group of people from usually multiple organizations are using it or are planning to use it. And then there's Andy. If there are independent groups that develop a standard, how does FAIRsharing decide which standard to promote? We, again, try to promote everything that's in scope equally, in that we allow you to make a record on FAIRsharing if you conform to what we define as our scope. So a record in FAIRsharing doesn't mean that you are FAIR, for example. That is determined by how well your resource aligns with the FAIR principles, and we don't assess that. But lots of tools, as I said in my presentation, do assess that, and we work together with what has become the FAIR assessment and evaluation tool community to make sure that they can get the information they need from FAIRsharing and from a variety of other sources, because it's not just FAIRsharing that provides the information they use for their assessments, so that they can get the information they need from us, because certainly we really want to stay out of that. There are enough players already in FAIR evaluation and assessment without FAIRsharing wading in, but we do certainly make our metadata available for all tools to use. So, and we don't try to decide on one over the other. We just try to decide, is it a community developed resource or for a community, or is it not? And did you just share the standards one? Oh, I love it. You're so lucky. I nearly put it in this presentation. Thank you, Anna, because that is one of my absolute favorite XKCD. I have a couple of their shirts, and that doesn't come on a shirt, but it's absolutely a major issue. And having come from a background of community standards development within the life sciences, in ontologies, in XML formats, in a variety of different things, where I was actually part of the development team for some of these, I know how hard it is to try to use other people's resources. We all talk about FAIR, but trying to walk the walk is a completely different thing. FAIRsharing uses, when you tag a record in FAIRsharing, with sort of subject tags, yes, to help with searching and findability. We have two types of subject tags: high level ones, that's like a research area, and then more low level technical ones. So there might be life science or biology on the top, and then your technical one might be light microscopy. Yes, so you have these different levels, and our domains, our technical terms, come from 50 different community ontologies, because what we did is we had let our users add free text tags for a long time. And then we tried to build a hierarchy that sat on top of those tags. And of course, that came from so many different places. And it was a real trial to actually integrate those. It's a challenge in itself, but we have a go, and it's probably not perfect, but it works for our needs. And so it's hard to actually implement FAIR in practice if you are a standards developer, and I certainly get that. Yes, yes, semantic schema mapping. I like the idea of that. I think that kind of effort, going to our communities and suggesting where there could be overlap, is probably something would need to be funded, Nico, honestly, because that sounds like a really interesting project, but one that we wouldn't have the funds to do right now. Is there a way for FAIR sharing for a user to be made aware of similar standards? Absolutely. You can search based on similar research areas. You can search based on similar licenses or similar other types of metadata. You can often find that similar standards are related to one another through the relationship graph. So you have a look at the relationship graph and see what's nearby in the network. And so you can very broadly speaking see, because we have lots of different types of relationships. We have whether one standard implements another, whether one standard extends another or profiles it. There's lots of different ways in which you can describe how standards interact. And so I think doing a little exploration within FAIR sharing within your domain and just clicking on lots of stuff is a great way to sort of get an idea of what's going on in your particular domain. I think that's all the ones on the chat. So if you have some other ones.
Yeah, I think we have Nicholas' hand raised. Is that just, Nicholas, did you want to add something to what you asked or said, or? Oh, okay. Right. Okay. No worries. Thank you. Yeah. And one more question on motivation in sensitization, since increasing reproducibility and promoting open science requires extra effort, extra work. So how do we insensitize people to be more open with their data sets?
Well, that's a really good question. And I would probably have to start by saying that historically, it's come from those people that create the pinch points in the research data lifecycle, you might say. I don't want to phrase this indelicately, but historically, the way people started submitting to domain-specific repositories was often because either the funders required it or the journals required it. So if we're looking on a historical perspective, the way you get people who are generating the data to make their data fair is by requiring FAIR by the people who have that sort of influence. So that would be policymakers and research infrastructures and journals. It really should, as I say, become part of the community and the community of practice, the sort of research data community in general. If you are a researcher, you should be told, when at the same time you're telling that it's really important to write your protocol and to make sure you follow it and to put all the information you need in your supplementary material, et cetera, that you also need to do a few things, a few simple things to make sure you can find it later, other people can find it later, and that it'll be in a format that won't just drive you nuts and you won't be able to get at it. So I think other than those historical routes, the main route would be through the data support roles, which is why I think, again, it's so important to fund those from a variety of different ways. So your library, your librarian, the data stewards that work with you, they should be advocating for this stuff on a regular basis throughout all the disciplines within the institution or project that you're in.
Yeah. Do you have by any chance any statistical data on the discipline representation on FAIR sharing I have a personal interest here because I was looking for my own discipline, which is organizational psychology. And I think we could do more in terms of being represented on FAIRsharing. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me see if I can just find the right link. Let me see. Okay, so what you can do is you can have a look at our subject browser. So if I just put the link in, this is, you will have seen a screenshot of it when I was giving my presentation. Let's see if I can get that. So this gives you an overview of the available hierarchies. It's not showing you based on number of records. So the sunburst doesn't change size based on number of records. The new wizard we have in development that will come out in the next few months does actually show you like a bubble visualization where those parts of the hierarchy in the subject areas that have more records will be bigger. So you can get a sort of broad overview. But what you can do is find your area of interest and it will tell you the number of records in it. So when you're browsing, find either on the left-hand side, you've got a text hierarchy that you can search. So you could start typing in archaeology or astronomy or something. And then it will give you a count of the number of times those tags are represented in records. Or you can use the sunburst and navigate that and find what you've got. I am absolutely convinced we are missing stuff, especially in the social sciences and humanities. Our community curators, for which we have probably 15 or so in this intake, we have nearly half of them are social science and humanities. But I was aware that, for example, was one of the ones where we're lower. So I'm glad that we've got a good group of them coming in to make sure that we can sort of bolster our numbers in that regard. Because FAIRsharing in some ways is a victim of its own success. Again, with this manual curation is always a bottleneck. And so the rate at which we're adding records and the way at which our users are adding records is faster than that we can keep up. So our community curation program is one way we're addressing that. Thank you, Nico. I'm glad you like it. And and what was this you say? Develop better, more visible attribution strategies that appeal to the egos of the data providers. I totally am with you on there. Attribution is a big thing, and that's one of the reasons we are so keen on attribution for our community curators who don't have egos in the same way as the data providers. But we'd be certainly welcome to think about that as well. I should probably also link to one of my favorite, seeing as Anna very kindly provided her favorite and relevant XKCD for this. I will leave you with a YouTube video. I'm not leaving you right now, but I shall leave it for you to look at later, which is my favorite way of describing what I do to people who don't know what I do. And so it's from the NYU library about, the potential pitfalls around data sharing and making data fair. Though they don't actually use the word fair, but I encourage you all to watch it at a later date. So yes, that's a long-winded way of answering. Oh, you you love that video.
Thanks very much for sharing, Allyson.
It is a very good video. Are there any other questions?
Questions in the chat?
It's okay. We're coming towards the top of the hour. We don't have to carry on. I don't want to keep people from their cups of tea,
Just to remind, the recording will be posted on YouTube. So on our YouTube channel. If there are no questions, I would like to thanks again, Allyson, for sharing with us, joining us, and and really educating us on this fascinating stuff. So much, there's so much we need to learn and do in this regard. And thanks very much for your interesting questions. I really enjoyed reading them, and your comments as well.
Yeah, they were great questions. Thank you, guys. And do feel free to email us anytime, or if anyone feels that they'd like to learn more about the resources in their domain, or maybe even curate with us, just drop us an email again and let us know that you might be interested.
Thank you.
Thank you.